Right, recording and transcription have started. So, welcome to the first afternoon session today. And it's my greatest of pleasure to be able to present Lindie Botes. Again, for those of you who learn languages on the internet, Lindie requires of no introduction whatsoever, but she's a designer and a language learner and a YouTuber, and she has over I think 250,000 subscribers on her channel on YouTube, and she gives lots of advice, on language learning in general. And also one of the reasons that I particularly admire her is that she's able to learn not just one class of languages, but different European and different Asian languages, such as Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, and French, Spanish, and Hungarian as well. And I'm also glad she's talking about design and languages and the interface. I remember that when I saw a similar presentation at the Polyglot conference, I think last year, and that actually inspired me to try to investigate, the idea of languages and science and bringing them together in the same way that she's brought together design and languages. So I'm very much looking forward to this. And Lindie, when you're ready, please fire away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Timothy. I just want to check that everyone can see my screen without any other things.
Yeah, we can see your screen. Do you want us to see your face as well? Or?
Oh, you can see what you want to see, but the presentation is the most important part. So as long as you can see that, we're good to go, right?
Do whatever you prefer. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'll just go ahead if you can all see the presentation clearly. Great. Well, thank you all for having me here and for being here today. The conference so far has been so interesting. I am definitely so far removed from science, but I do work in tech, and we all love languages, so I hope we can see some overlaps here today. So a bit about what we'll talk about today. The first half of my presentation will be how I integrate languages into my life and work. I'm going to go through a bit of a case study on a project that I'm working on at the moment to build a language learning flashcard app. And then the second part will be more about the overlap of tech and languages, and some smaller case studies about how to design for multilingual audiences in app design. So for those of you who don't know me, but thank you, Tim, already for the introduction, I won't spend too much time on this, but by day I work as a product designer. That means I design apps and websites. So I'm leading a UX design team at a startup in Singapore. And I also make language learning videos on my YouTube channel on the side. So a few years ago, many decades ago when I was a school child, I used to always see languages just as schoolwork. I lived in a few different countries and I learned French and Arabic at school, and I thought, oh, more French homework, or oh my gosh, I almost failed my Arabic test. And I told myself, oh, I'll never learn Spanish. So languages really weren't important to me. And I studied information design at university, and I used to be very scared of app design. I said, oh, I love graphic design too much. I'll never know how to work in tech. That just sounds really scary to me. But today, languages are the biggest passion in my life. I've learned over 15 languages to varying levels, but I can only communicate and work effectively in about 8 of them. And I am indeed working in tech. So really never say never. So let me talk a bit about how I integrate languages into my life from childhood to working life. Whoop, click back. So I've always had a curiosity, and I still do, for different languages and cultures. I grew up in Pakistan, France, the UAE, and South Africa and Japan, and I always considered myself quite culturally sensitive. I had friends from all over, but as I mentioned earlier, I never really took languages seriously until around high school or after. So my home languages are English and Afrikaans, and I took French, Arabic, and Urdu at school. But only after that, seeking escape from these shackles of public school language education, my first self-taught foreign language was Korean. So I've been learning Korean for over 11 years now. And the goal for myself that I set was to change everything that I normally do in my life into Korean. So I got a job in high school at a Korean restaurant. I would try and take notes on the menu. This was when I was still a young learner, about 2 or 3 years into Korean. And I tried to change everything I do to bring Korean into my life. So my school notes, my diary, my shopping lists, I converted all of that into Korean. And I had pen pals who I would write letters to in Korea for many years. After that, around university, my family moved to Japan, and I stayed in South Africa. But I would visit Japan on and off over the span of 4 years. So it was just a natural next step for me to progress from learning Korean to going towards Japanese. And while I was studying information design at university in South Africa, going to Japan, there was so much design inspiration around me. Japan is a fantastic country for graphic design inspiration. So I used to go to design exhibitions every day. I would collect all of these posters, and I would come back to South Africa with so much new inspiration from Japanese design to bring into my own designs. We also had to do internships when I was at university, and I thought, well, why not give myself a linguistic and a design challenge to do my internships in Japan? So here's a book that I used. I don't have it next to me right now, but it's this massive textbook that they sell in Japan of graphic design agencies, and it has the contact details of people. So I sent emails in my broken Japanese to a lot of these people saying, hey, I'm interested in Japanese and design. Are you offering any internships? I would highlight the words I don't know and study Japanese through the context of design. You can even see here, I put notes of exactly when and where I was going to meet this person for an interview. So I did get a few internships in Japan, and I started working in packaging design. Here's a photo of me working late at night designing a logo. And this logo is actually used on packaging design, which is currently being sold in Tokyo Tower in Japan. And then another half language, half design challenge that I gave myself was to design one poster in Japanese every single day for the month of August. I believe this was in 2017. This was before I started really working in app design. I was more working in graphic design. And I was constantly looking for ways to combine my love of languages and design. So by creating some kind of a creative challenge for myself, but bringing in languages as well, like limiting myself to only use Japanese in my poster designs, I could learn a lot more about Japanese as well as practice my graphic design skills. So after that, a few years later, I moved to Singapore to work in product design. And of course, that spurred on an interest to learn more Mandarin Chinese. I had only dabbled in Chinese before that, but now I felt a lot more serious about continuing Chinese. But as Singapore has it, it's quite an international place. There's a lot of language exchange meetups pre-COVID. So I sort of fell into the linguistic snowball trap of picking up Hungarian, Vietnamese, Tagalog, and Spanish. Remember at the start, I said, oh, I'm never going to learn Spanish. Well, yes, never say never, because I'm completely obsessed with learning Spanish at the moment. And I think languages have just helped me grow in confidence. I've only been learning Hungarian for a few years, and I'm a complete beginner. But earlier this year, I was invited live on Hungarian television to do an interview in Hungarian. And I feel if I hadn't had all of these languages, leading me to building connections with different people and realizing how helpful and beneficial languages are to building relationships with people and growing in your confidence, I would have never taken on this challenge to speak broken Hungarian on live television. So what I'm doing now is finding ways to combine my work in tech with my language learning. For instance, design systems are something that I'm really excited and interested in, and I'll talk more about design systems in a moment. But what I like to do is, instead of researching design systems in English or Afrikaans, why not do it in French or Spanish? So here's a podcast I love listening to. If anybody is interested in UX design, it's called Parlons Design in French, and the episode is about how Microsoft has their design system. So at the same time that I'm learning about design, I'm also practicing my French. And similarly, I love reading articles about tech and UX design in Spanish. As Timothy always says, it's killing two birds with one stone. So why do it in English when I could also learn Spanish and learn design at the same time? The same is with Hungarian. And it's really funny that I don't even think I can count from 1 to 10 in Hungarian. I don't even know if I can order coffee, but I can tell you all about user research, UX kutatás in Hungarian, because I'm just so fascinated by design and user research that everything I read in Hungarian is related to design. So it's a bit disproportionate, my vocabulary, but at least I'm enjoying myself. So the article here actually that I was reading on this website called innovationdesign.hu, it's a Hungarian design and tech website. The author here, Mr. Norbert, we've actually become friends online. We message each other on Twitter or Instagram. And I just think this is such a great story of how languages and tech can connect you. I also like to bring in languages in small parts in my day at work. So working in Singapore, there's a lot of Mandarin Chinese speakers. So here's just a sticky note that my colleague left on my laptop when she was leaving. She was just saying goodbye in Chinese. Another colleague of mine speaks Japanese, so we message each other in Japanese. And these are just small things that I do every day to bring more languages into my life. And it really does add up in the long run. And what I'll transition into now is talking more about tech and app design. So what I'm really looking to do now is transition my career. I'm actually working in prop tech, in property, but I'm looking to move fully into language learning app design. Really the perfect combination of tech and languages. So I'm freelancing for an app called Polygloss, which is a gamified language learning app. And before I continue, just pausing to make sure that we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say UI UX design or product design. These terms are kind of thrown around online. So UI UX design stands for user interface and user experience design. Sometimes we just call it product design, not to be confused with product design like making chairs. Sometimes when I say I'm a product designer, people are like, oh, do you make lamps and chairs? I'm like, no, I make apps. So some examples of what I do here is a budgeting app that a friend and I are working on, or what I do at my company right now, working in property, helping people in Singapore find homes. And what I'll transition into talking about now is the language learning flashcard app that some friends and I are building. So a bit about building this flashcard app. I'm going to rewind a bit and start talking about Twitter. So Twitter is where I met Timothy about the conference, and here's my tweet about the conference. So on Twitter, we have a really large language learners community where we talk about languages, we practice our languages with each other, we keep each other accountable, and it's under the hashtag of LangTweet, like language Twitter. And yes, this person agrees, LangTweet people are so nice. So if you're on Twitter, please come join us. There's a lot of us. But what I'm getting to is that I joined Twitter a few years ago to start practicing Korean. I wanted to read and write a lot more on Twitter in Korean. Then a few months ago, I met somebody who said, hey, I have a friend who wants to build an app and they need a designer. I met this person on Twitter and I got put in touch with them. So I was put in touch with a friend and we decided it's a good idea to start building this app together. And the app we're building is a flashcard app for German. I am certainly not here to promote the app. In fact, it's very much still a work in progress, but I'm just putting this here for some context so you know what I'm talking about. It's just a flashcard app and the first language that we are releasing for is German. And my job is to design all of the interfaces, so the web page, the way the screens look, and so forth. There's a term in tech and product design thinking which is called dog fooding. I just think that's the ugliest word ever, but here we are. It basically means using your own products, like eating your own food. So while testing this product that we're building, while I'm working through seeing, are the screens working? You know, can I click through the flashcards properly? You know, sitting in my favorite cafe, playing on some German flashcards, I was like, I think I'm actually picking up a lot of German. I have access to our spreadsheet that contains all of the German words that we put in our app. And I've really never learned German or even been interested in it But recently I wrote on Twitter, I keep wanting to learn German. What is happening to me? So as a result of joining Twitter to learn Korean, meeting someone, working in tech, somehow it just so happened that now I've decided to learn German. Two things about how we work at this flashcard app. Our first principle that we really want to move towards is using less English. This is quite tricky because we're only 3 people in the company. 2 people speak German fluently and 2 people speak Spanish, but we all have English in common. So what Alex and I here are trying to do is whenever we message each other about an update in our app, we try and do it in Spanish. Alex is obviously way better in Spanish than I am. I am todavía soy muy principiante, still a beginner, but this is great practice for me to practice my Spanish and, work in tech at the same time. So as our company grows, we are looking to use English as little as possible. The second thing that I'm going to focus a lot on is systems thinking. This is something that comes from tech or product design, which I believe can actually be applied to language learning. So let me show you how I use systems thinking first to build this language learning app that I'm making. Here's a quick overview of our design system, and I'll go into detail about how this was built. I use a principle called atomic design. This was coined by Brad Frost. And I hope as scientists, I might have your attention when I mention atoms, molecules, and components, because these are terms that we use when we build design systems. So atomic design is a methodology for creating design systems, where you work from the smallest component, called an atom, up to an organism, which could be a web page, like a page on a website or an app. So let's take a look at this page. It's the game page where you open your flashcards. So this is a page. Let's zoom in. This is the flashcard organism. Inside the flashcard organism, we have buttons. These are what we call molecules. So let's go to one of the molecules, which is our button molecule. What is it made up of? It is made up of atoms. We have an atom for a color and an atom for a font style. So combining the colored background and the font will create this molecule of a button. This is atomic system design thinking that I use. And if I create all of my components together in a single library or a design system, it makes building products in the future a lot faster. Instead of having to recreate something from scratch, I have everything I need, kind of like little Lego blocks that live together that I can pull from when I'm creating new designs. So that is systems thinking in design, right? So a design system, we now know, is a series of components, its rules, its structure that can be reused to create new designs. So I like to apply this to my language learning. As a design system is to product design, maybe we can think of grammar is to language learning, right? Grammar is also a system. It's a structure of languages in general, and it takes into consideration sentence structure, syntax, morphology, nouns, verbs, you have it. So how do I use systems thinking to learn languages? Last year, I was going to write a standardized Korean exam, the 한국어 능력 시험, the official Korean exam. And I realized if I wanted to pass this exam, there is a number of grammar structures that I still need to learn that I was unfamiliar with. So the easiest way for me as a visual person, as a designer, to plan out my learning and not get overwhelmed was to create a little system for myself. So I wrote down every single grammar structure that I needed to learn, and I assigned a color to it. Yellow meaning I already know this. Pink meaning I've heard of it, I just need to look at it again. And blue meaning this is completely new to me. And I assigned it a color code, and then an open circle means I still need to study it, and a colored circle means I have finished it. And this way I did not feel overwhelmed with how much I needed to study. I was able to map it to learning a certain number of grammar structures per day before the exam, and I really systematized my language learning, and I was able to pass the exam with a higher score than I thought I would. Another super basic way that I believe some of us are already doing is just color coding our notes. So Hungarian has both definite and indefinite verbs, which are the bane of my existence. But by just cleaning up my notes a little bit and assigning a blue color to the definite conjugation and a black color to the indefinite, and having all of my English in red, a very tricky language like Hungarian becomes a little more simplified for me. When I page through my notes when I'm studying, I don't need to have that extra mental processing to be like, you know, what's English, what's Hungarian, what's a verb, what's a noun, because I have a very streamlined color coding system. Similarly for Korean, when I practice writing Korean essays, or I might be reading an article about design and transcribing it over to Korean, I use yellow for any connecting phrases, anything where two words are put together to mean something new. Green will be a new vocabulary word, and then pink will be what the meaning of the word is. Another way that I employ sort of systems in my language learning is how I plan my languages. I have a little calendar book. This is my book right here, which I use for the year to track how I'm learning my languages and what activities I do. Obviously, working in design and tech, I love data. I love visualizing and seeing where my time goes. So I have a little color code here for every language that I'm learning, and I'll map it out to the calendar to see, okay, on this day I wrote an essay and so forth. Obviously, this is not going to make me more fluent in a language. It's not really helping me learn. It's just a way for me to visualize language learning and make it even more apparent in my life. So let's talk a bit more about how we can use some more product or tech thinking and frameworks in language learning. We've talked about system design and how we can use systems in our languages, but let's look at some other frameworks that we use in tech. So in product development, where I work in a startup, there are generally two frameworks that you can employ for building apps and digital products. They are called Waterfall and Agile, and I'll dive into them in just a moment. What we also do at startups is we don't have that much time and resources to dedicate a whole year to planning and brainstorming a product and then releasing it. So we do lots of small experiments, small things over time to see, is this going to work? Is that going to work? And then we release a new feature in our app. We also constantly review what we're doing. We look at data tracking to see if are people clicking on this button? How many people open this web page? How far do they scroll on the page? We look at data constantly and iterate on our processes. So I'll give you a few seconds to think about how could you bring this over to language learning? Well, how I do it is I take some of these tech frameworks and I apply it to my language learning. I love experimenting with my languages. Instead of limiting myself to only a few languages, or like past me said, I'm never going to learn Spanish, I'm never going to learn German, I let myself experiment. I let myself dabble in languages. And I constantly review and look back at my process and my progress, and I'm not afraid to change methods. Let's look at the first framework called Waterfall. It is very sequential. It's like a waterfall where the first action has to happen before you move on to the next action. So let's say we're building an app. Well, first we need the requirements. We are building a budgeting app for millennials. Then I'm going to do some sketches. I'm going to draw the design. Then I'm going to give it to the developer who's going to code it. Then we're going to test it. And then we're going to finish the project and then maintain it to make sure that it is working well. So Waterfall is for very concrete and well-defined projects. 2 years ago, I tried to apply the Waterfall methodology to my language learning. This is just an example I wrote up. This is not me, but let's think, how might somebody apply a Waterfall framework to their language learning? You might say, I want to learn French because I want to get a promotion at work. You've got your goal. My goal is to study French to a B1 level. And then you assign some timeframes to yourself. I need to buy a textbook and finish it by June. In August, I'm going to take lessons. In September, I'll take practice tests before doing my exam. And then I'll go to France and, maintain my French, right? This could be maybe a waterfall approach to learning languages. And then 2 years ago, I made a video about my very lofty plans to learn 12 languages in a year. A disclaimer, I wasn't actually learning 12 languages. Some of the languages were already at an intermediate level and I was just maintaining them. But essentially, I had this really long plan that I thought would pull me through the entire year. I wanted to write journal entries every day. I had this textbook that I had to finish, and I had a whole timeline for learning these 12 languages. Do you think I was successful? Absolutely not. And things changed. You know, I got interested in other languages. I just thought, the waterfall approach is not working for me. So let's look at the second framework, which is agile. Agility, right? You're constantly moving, you're changing things. Agile is iterative and cyclical and collaborative. This is how we work at startups. So let's say you have a product like an app, let's say the property search app that I work for right now. Then we have small features, or rather we have big goals that we want to achieve every quarter. And then from those big goals, we create small subtasks. And then from those subtasks, we say, which one is the most important to work on? Which is going to bring me the best value right now? And then we work on those in a sprint. A sprint is generally 2 weeks. You have design, development, testing, which you test it with actual people, usability testing. Then you deploy the product. And then the most important part is to review it. Say, how did it go? Did it reach the goals we have? Are people using it? And then you do it over and over, smaller things at a time. So how I work agile in tech is by running a lot of small experiments. Here's just a screen cap from a prototype I was building. This way I don't need to go to the developers and say, please, can you build this app for me? I can say, let me just connect a prototype, test it with a bunch of users, and then iterate on my processes and my designs to make it better. I also use data tracking. I will look at something like how many of our Android users, how many people who use an iPhone are clicking here. Is this page really the most important page that we should be redesigning? Stuff like that. So how might I be using an agile methodology in my language learning? I am ahead of myself. One more example of how I use it in tech is retrospectives. So what we do as a team after every feature is we have a little retro meeting where we say what went well, what didn't go well, and what I have learned. And being able to go back and look at what you've done and analyze it, it can make the path forward a lot better. And you're always open to change and open to improvements. That doesn't happen in waterfall, where you've already defined everything. So I try and use an agile approach to my language learning. For me, language learning is just a hobby. I want to make sure that my processes, language learning resources, and methods will help me learn in a fun and fast manner. So what I did this year is I split my language learning goals into quarters. So that's how we work, you know, in corporate or in tech, you have your goals for quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3. And I said, okay, for the first quarter of the year, I'm going to focus on Hungarian and Spanish. And then I'm going to look back at the end of each quarter and do little mini retrospectives with myself to improve my processes. I'm very open and public about my processes. I'm not scared to make mistakes online, and I'm very open about sharing my progress. So on my YouTube channel, instead of saying, 12 languages for a whole year, I have shorter videos which says, hey, this is how it's going with my language learning. It's been going great. It's been going terrible. Here's my progress. I invite you to look into my journal as well. And then I set a lot smaller goals for myself instead of big, vague goals. Again, Twitter, my favorite place on the internet. I have a thread on Twitter where I keep track of my language learning goals for every quarter. And I'm also open to changing that as I go along. So you'll see here, quarter 1, I had my main foci, which were Tagalog and Hungarian. Tagalog has since fallen away. I've sort of lost interest in learning Tagalog, and it's full on Spanish and Hungarian now. But as you can see, as I go along, I give updates. For instance, I realized I can't do 1 chapter of a book a week. I can do 1 chapter a week, not just 2 chapters in a month. So I change my plan as I go along. I'm being agile with my language learning. Again, data tracking and reports, something that I do a lot at work, I've brought over to my language learning. I do want to emphasize looking at the amount of time you spend learning a language is not going to make you fluent. It's what you do with the language in that allocated time that is really important. But for me, as a visual person who loves data, I like to track my language learning. I use an app to time where my time goes. And it's sort of a different way. Instead of saying, I want to do 10 hours of Hungarian this week, I just say, I love Hungarian, I'm going to learn Hungarian. Let's see how much time I actually do spend on it. And then I adjust my plans accordingly to maybe how I feel, what new languages are exciting to me, and so forth. And then here's just a messy page from my notebook. At the end of a quarter, I will evaluate my goals, see how it went, count how many hours I've done on italki, learning a language. I'll write a little report of how my language learning went. And sometimes I might even write that report in a different language, like in French. So that's a way to practice my learning, plus also be more mindful and analyze how my language learning has gone. Now for the last part, let's look at multilingual app design. So how languages can be incorporated into UX design to create localized experiences. I live in Singapore, and Singlish is something very common here. It's casual, it's fun, everyone understands it, and it's very unique to Singapore. So there's an app I use called Gojek, which is basically to order a taxi. And you'll see here on the loading screen, instead of saying loading, it says waita, getting ready. And that's so cool to me because in Singlish we say waita, give me a minute, wait, waita. We use this to just sort of soften things. And this app wouldn't work anywhere else in the world. People would be like, what is this, a typo? But when you're using it in Singapore, really the power of language is coming into app design, and it creates a more localized, delightful experience. Let's go to Japan. Japanese apps are notorious for being very visually stimulating and crowded. Well, why is that? Japanese audiences value trust and transparency and having access to information up front. So these are both makeup apps. The one on the right is from Revlon. It's, I believe, an American app, and you can see the product photos really emphasized. There's a lot of white space. There's not so much text, right? We want it to look premium. But in Japan, a makeup app will have everything up front. This is your menu. This is a discount thing. This is all the information about the products. And this works in Japan because people want that kind of information up front. So me as a designer, being sensitive to languages and cultures, I can't go and work in Japan and say, this app here on the right is the most beautiful app that we need. I need to take into account how languages and culture influences app design. A very interesting thing that I saw last week is Marie Kondo, or KonMari. Her YouTube channel for English audiences is very clean, minimal, streamlined, but her same channel for Japanese audiences has all of this bright and bold text up front. And she clearly knows that this is what works in Japanese markets, because this is the type of advertising and posters that you'll get in Japan. All the information is up front and you feel safe in making your purchase decision. Another interesting example that I'll mention is when I worked in South Africa, we were working on a mobile money banking app. For NDA reasons, I can't include any screenshots. But when we were testing this app, the, what do you call it? I've just lost my ability to speak English. You know the thing that gives you the transactions that you've made, like your payment report? My English is failing me, but it said credit and debit. And we realized that people were taking a while to complete actions on the app. If we say, check your transaction history, they were able to get to the task eventually, but they sort of struggled. And we realized simply by changing credit and debit to money in and money out, and adding some colors, green and red, the rate of understanding of our users went up so much, and they were able to complete the tasks much faster. So this really shows the power of language in interface design to create digital products that are a lot simpler for people. Another thing that always fascinates me is the writing direction of languages. This is the same app in both English and Arabic. And English is obviously left to right, and Arabic is right to left. So look here at the call and the WhatsApp button. It's from the left to the right in English, and in Arabic you might think it's flipped, but because they read from right to left, the buttons are positioned that way too. And I just think that that is very interesting. But talking about direction, it's not always just buttons and alphabets that might be flipped when you're designing for a different audience, but anything that includes motion as well. So this little guy on a bicycle, in left to right languages, he's facing that direction to indicate motion, and then maybe in a Hebrew or an Arabic interface, the little icon will be flipped. And then lastly, character count. When I'm working on projects that have multiple languages, I didn't design this, by the way, this is just an example. It's important to make sure that your interface can cater for the space that characters take up. So let's look on booking.com, the menu here at the top. It goes out of the screen. You have to scroll horizontally to access the menu. But in Mandarin Chinese, it's so short. The characters take up less space, and you're actually left with a lot more breathing space. But Hungarian is just a headache. The words are so long. And maybe Italian is also a headache. So this is something that is looking at the word views, like views on a YouTube video. When you're designing interfaces for multiple languages, you have to make sure that your screen design takes into account how long other languages will be if you're translating it. So Italian, the ratio of English to Italian will be 3 times longer than the English word for views. And then Korean is much shorter. So just something that always fascinates me when I'm designing. So let me just close off in summary. Language learning has not just taken me on a linguistic and a cultural journey, but it's also shaped the way that I look at graphic design. It's shaped the way that I build products and work with people around the world. I'm able to bring different languages into my daily work and just make life interesting and exciting. And you don't need a career in linguistics to succeed in self-study language learning. All that I want to encourage you to do is to find a way to combine language learning with your passions and build language connections into your life. Thank you so much for having me today. I think we might have a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Lindie, for a very inspiring talk. And I thought the last message was great. Look for ways, to integrate a language into your passions, into your everyday activities. That's how in science, a lot of researchers learn English, because they're using it every day in their work, which they are passionate about. And you can do the same, as you showed, for lots of other languages as well. I also like to notice the theme of self-development that was also touched on by Joanna earlier today, by learning languages. And also, one thing that came to mind was you talked about how different audiences will have different expectations when a product is presented. One thing that I think is not talked about much in science is how we should present our scientific data. I suspect that very often we tend towards a very Western European approach in presenting science, which may not necessarily be what other cultures are expecting as well. Yes, there is time for questions. I see that Joanna, you have a question. Oh, maybe you forgot to put your hand down. Any questions? Please go ahead.
I would have one for Lindie. Hi, Lindie. Thanks for your talk. I'm Erica, and I just noted in the chat that I did hear you speak Hungarian, and I don't believe that you are entirely a beginner, but so I'm completely amazed that you're Hungarian. So congratulations on that. An actual question I wanted to ask you is how you managed to actually maintain your languages, how you managed to keep them separate in your head. I see you are so well organized in your learning process, and I suppose that integrates sort of a maintenance process as well, and you keep working all your languages. But how do you actually manage to separate things in your head? Because that's one of my biggest issues.
Igen, nagyon szépen köszönöm. Nagyon nehéz válaszolni. Like, it's very hard to answer this question because it depends on language to language. But really what I found that works the best for me is to not start a new language until I'm comfortable with where my other languages are, or until I acknowledge that by learning this other language, I am going to confuse languages. And by learning 3, 4, 5 languages at the same time, the other languages will get less time proportionately. So already just telling myself that and making peace with the fact that I will not reach fluency maybe as fast as somebody who's learning one language removes the pressure for me. I don't necessarily confuse languages to the extent that if I'm speaking French, I will suddenly switch to Korean. What I find happens, and I'm not exactly sure why, is that it's usually the smaller words like or e. So in French, or e meaning and in Spanish, that I confuse. These really tiny words just slip in there, and I don't know how to fix that yet. I just need to practice on those. But as you've mentioned, most of my time goes to maintenance of these languages. So, doing my work in other languages, reading and researching a lot, and just acknowledging that it really does take time. I don't have the magical answer to how it's possible to balance multiple languages. Perhaps Richard Simcott is better at that than me. But I do always remind myself that it's just a hobby and it's okay if I mess up or if I progress slowly.
Yeah, great, thanks. It's reassuring somewhere as well.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
In the chat.
Oh, they're in the chat. Yes. So Lindie, can you see at the chat? Or shall I read it out?
Yes, please. I see a few, so I'm not sure which one to start with.
Oh, you could start with, I think, Dominic Thorpe's question.
How long do you tend to spend per week on maintaining a language if you're not actively learning it? The honest answer would be not very long, but the nature of doing design means I have a lot of time to listen to things. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, hours and hours and hours of podcasts, not necessarily podcasts, that teach you the language, but just, hearing the language in the background helps me a lot. I would say on the weekends, I dedicate about an hour or two to active studying, but the rest is just like watching TV shows or listening to podcasts. It's really not a lot of time, to be honest.
And we have a question from Kanta as well in the chat.
Wait, no, do it now. Oh, I think you're just bringing a connection between Singlish and Bengali. That is really interesting. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for watching my channel. I appreciate it.
Okay. Oh, there's one more. Apparently, one more person has their hand up. Can't quite. Oh, it's Arse, if I'm pronouncing that right. Please go ahead and ask.
Hi. Right now I'm learning my third language, which is Japanese, but I started like you, but with Instagram, to follow people that are talking in Japanese and with all my social media. But I think I started following so many people that I became overwhelmed and I stopped using Instagram at all. Do you have any tips to not be like so overwhelmed with it?
Yeah, well, I think you're on the right track to already acknowledging that this has been overwhelming for you. So a few months ago, I also decided just to take a complete social media break and realize that it is actually possible to learn languages without being online. We have great communities on Instagram and Twitter, but if it is making you feel overwhelmed, there's really no shame in taking a break from it. So I think you're already on the right track to acknowledging, hey, maybe I should unfollow some people, maybe I should spend less time on Instagram, and really sit down with yourself and reprioritize and say, what are my goals in this language? If I want to be able to speak, am I getting enough speaking practice with limited access, right? Maybe you'll take a course with one person instead of just listening to people speaking online. So think about how you learn best. Don't compare to what people are saying online, follow as many people as you can to always hear it around you. That works for some people, but over time you are going to learn about what methods work for you. And Really just listen to yourself, and if you feel overwhelmed, completely fine to take a break and reprioritize.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Yes, yeah, Lindie, that's what the advice you gave sounds a bit like the sprint strategy that you talked about in your talk. Are there any more questions? Luis?
I can ask a question.
Yes, Luis.
For a quick answer, Lindie, how can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good. How good a learner do you consider yourself? Because I think you're a pretty good one.
What an interesting question. Well, thank you for the compliment, but it's such a multifaceted question, right? Because if I think of it from a Korean or Japanese education context, how learners are evaluated is your ability to take a test, your ability to memorize things. You know, maybe a good learner in a Korean context looks a certain way, and I would be a terrible learner. Maybe for other people who look at it through the lens of YouTube, being a good language learner is being able to speak very fluently. Some people who speak very fluently might be lacking vocabulary. They're just good with phrases. So it depends what lens you look at it. But for me, what's important is just enjoying it. I learn better when it is fun for me. And that's why I said, I don't even know how to count to 10 in Hungarian, but at least I can read articles about UX research. So I think in that way, finding ways to combine my passions and making it fun for myself, in my eyes, makes me a good learner because I enjoy it, not necessarily because I'm fluent.
Thank you.
Okay. Right. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much, Lindie, again for a wonderful talk. And we will go on to the next speaker, who is my colleague, Philip Erika. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And Erika is a lecturer in, or maybe a senior lecturer in French, but she's also become very good at coding. So she knows both human languages and computer languages. I'm sure she'll tell us much more about that in her talk. So, Erika, whenever you're ready, please share your screen.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah.
Just, do you want this to be recorded?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you wish.